The young and the restless spoilers in the quiet aftermath of chaos that never quite touched them directly, Nate and Victoria found themselves standing in the ruins of their own personal tragedies, far removed from the deadly spirals spinning across Europe, yet deeply immersed in emotional landscapes equally haunted. The death of Damien had shattered Nate's sense of identity, reopening wounds that had never truly healed from his complicated past, while the loss of Cole left Victoria hollow in a way she didn't dare articulate. And yet, in that shared ache, something long buried had begun to stir, not merely grief, but memory. Memory of a time when they had looked at each other not as enemies or even allies, but as two people drawn to something neither of them could name, but both of them undeniably felt. Once, Nate had walked the pristine corporate halls of Newman Enterprises with ambition in his veins and Victoria by his side, her icy exterior hiding a fervent belief in his potential. Together, they had navigated the brutal tides of business strategy and family politics, until the weight of bloodlines and loyalty pulled them apart. Victoria had chosen the Newman name, the dynasty over the man, and Nate had been left to watch it all crumble, banished from the empire they'd helped build. That betrayal had cut deeper than a mere dismissal from an office. It had rewritten the very fabric of their relationship, turning passion into silence, trust into suspicion. But some silences stretch so long they eventually collapse under the pressure of unspoken words. Now, with the passage of time and the arrival of death in places they hadn't expected it, both Nate and Victoria found themselves circling back to one another, not out of strategy, not for power, but for survival. Neither had been invited to the fateful gathering in Nice, a calculated exclusion that might have once wounded their pride but now served only to deepen their confusion. What had really happened to Damien? Why had Kane returned so suddenly and conveniently with promises of transformation? And could any of it be trusted? But those questions, though important, felt like background noise to the storm of emotions reawakening between them. Nate, hollowed by the loss of his brother, had wandered through Port Charles like a man displaced, unsure of where to plant his loyalty. The world around him had become fragmented, Amy's suffering, Audra's veiled ambition, the unanswered calls from France, and it had pushed him back toward the only person who had once offered him clarity. Victoria, equally shaken, had taken refuge in silence. Her family, always fractured and fraught with power games, now seemed farther from her than ever. Victor mourned Cole with a fury that turned inward, isolating himself from everyone, including his daughter. There were no comforting arms waiting, no home fires burning. And so when Nate appeared at her door late one night, his eyes tired, his voice hesitant, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like inevitability. What followed between them wasn't a declaration or a promise, but a slow unraveling of restraint. They sat for hours, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, exploring the ruins of their past without judgment or blame. Nate admitted that part of him had never stopped believing in what they once shared, even when ambition and betrayal pulled them apart. Victoria confessed that she had never truly moved on, that the men who came after Nate were merely ghosts in the shape of distraction. And somewhere between confessions and tearful reminiscing, they began to rebuild something neither of them dared to name. This renewed intimacy was unlike their first affair, more cautious, but also more profound. It was not fueled by boardroom victories or strategic seduction, but by something older, something more human. In the privacy of her home, far from the corporate arenas where they once sparred, Victoria allowed herself to be vulnerable again. She cried for her father's grief, for the family she could never fix, for the sisterhood with Nikki that had become strained by power struggles. Nate held her through it, not as a lover grasping at passion, but as a man who had lost everything and found one flickering light in her. Still, neither of them could fully escape the external forces threatening to intrude. Audra, though no longer directly in Nate's orbit, remained a shadow with her own ambitions, and her subtle manipulations in the corporate underworld continued to ripple outward. There were whispers of Kane attempting to redeem himself in Genoa City, hosting quiet dinners and talking of legacies and second chances. But those close to Damien, and to truth, knew that nothing about Kane's return felt sincere. To Nate, the very mention of Kane evoked unease. A man that slippery did not simply reappear without motive, and Nate had no intention of being caught in his web again. Victoria, too, remained cautious. Though she had once entertained alliances with Kane for business purposes, she now viewed him through a colder lens. The timing of his rebranding, his soft-spoken remorse, his sudden attempts to befriend Victor again, it all felt rehearsed. And worst of all, both Nate and Victoria were beginning to sense that Damien's death might not have been a random act of violence, but something orchestrated from within. If that were true, then someone was playing a long game, and the consequences had only just begun to unfold. Yet amid that looming suspicion, Nate and Victoria carved out their own sanctuary, even if it was fragile. They began to spend more time together, slowly venturing out. Quiet walks, coffee shared before sunrise, late-night drives without direction. They talked about nothing and everything: the ethics of family loyalty, the loneliness of legacy, the price of love in a world that prized manipulation. And for a brief moment, it seemed possible that two people who had once broken each other could now be each other's salvation. But peace in Genoa City was always temporary. Just as Victoria began to imagine a future not defined by power or betrayal, the tremors of the past began to shake the present. News arrived that the investigation in France was expanding, that Damien's body might have been tampered with, that audio surveillance had captured more than anyone expected. And with that news came the renewed pressure of secrecy and survival. Victoria feared that whatever happiness she had found with Nate would be shattered once more. Not by ambition, but by danger. Nate, sensing the storm returning, began to pull away, not out of coldness, but out of fear. He had lost his brother, his career, his sense of self, and now, just as he was beginning to rebuild with Victoria, he worried the same fate awaited her. He tried to protect her the only way he knew how, by distancing himself. But Victoria had changed. She no longer waited for men to make decisions for her. She went to him, challenged him, reminded him that love was not protection, it was partnership. And slowly, he let her back in. Together, they stood not as remnants of a failed romance, but as something new. Something weathered but strong. They didn't know what the future held, whether the truth about Damien would destroy what was left of Nate's family, whether Victor's grief would turn to rage and consume them all, or whether Kane's supposed rebirth would birth new horrors. But for now, in this space carved out by loss, they had each other. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Even as the walls of the Newman Empire trembled, even as new players emerged in the city's power games, even as Audra watched from a distance calculating her next move, Victoria and Nate remained unbroken. Perhaps Genoa City was not a place where love could flourish easily, but perhaps that was what made it matter more when it did. And perhaps, just perhaps, Nate and Victoria were ready to defy the legacy of destruction that had once defined them. Because in a world where trust was currency and betrayal was sport, to choose love was the boldest act of all. If you'd like to continue this story, perhaps adding a twist involving Audra's sabotage, Victor's discovery of new evidence, or Kane attempting to drag Nate back into a conspiracy, just let me know, and I'll keep building the narrative forward. As the days slipped by and the shockwaves from the events in Nice continued to paralyze those who had been directly involved, Nate and Victoria found themselves increasingly isolated from the center of the storm. But that distance, rather than alienating them, became a quiet sanctuary, a space in which grief could be processed without the noise of scandal, bloodlines, or business. While others stumbled through raw trauma and whispered suspicions in the aftermath of Damien's death and the estate's upheaval, Nate and Victoria, though not present in France, began to feel the emotional echoes in Genoa City. There were empty phone calls, news reports with missing pieces, conversations that cut off too quickly, and a growing realization that something unspoken had changed forever. Yet it wasn't just what they had missed that pulled them together. It was what they were still feeling. In the quiet evenings when the city softened into dusk, Nate and Victoria began talking more, finding comfort in the simple act of being heard. What began as small exchanges, polite condolences, soft-voiced check-ins, soon deepened into layered conversations about pain, regrets, and the invisible scars they both carried. Nate shared memories of Damien, not as the troubled, erratic figure others remembered, but as the brother who once protected him from their fractured world. Victoria, in turn, spoke of Cole, of the complicated affection and silence that had grown between them, and the sorrow of losing a piece of her past that she had only just begun to rediscover. These weren't rehearsed speeches or guarded dialogues. They were raw, unfiltered admissions whispered between sips of wine and glances that lasted longer than they should have. It was during one such moment, a rainy evening that had drenched the city in silver mist, that Victoria looked at Nate and quietly said the words that broke down what little distance remained between them: "My door will always be open for you." And with that, the carefully maintained boundary between grief and intimacy dissolved. Claire, who had become a silent observer of Victoria's emotional state, had quietly nodded in agreement, her presence a gentle reminder that even the most guarded hearts could find ways to heal again. Victoria wasn't simply offering comfort, she was offering space, not just physical, but emotional, for Nate to be whoever he was becoming now, unburdened by the pressure of titles or expectations. This openness ushered in a fragile new dynamic between them. They weren't lovers, not yet, but they were no longer just old colleagues or ex-partners navigating shared regret. Something far more delicate was forming, rooted not in passion but in empathy, the rarest kind of intimacy that grows in silence and understanding. Nate, having spent months avoiding meaningful connection, found himself longing to stay just a little longer every time he visited Victoria. He would linger at the door, pause mid-sentence as if searching for the courage to say something deeper, and more often than not, she would silently invite him in without needing to ask. There was no pressure, no need to define what they were. It was simply enough to be present, to listen, to speak, to hold space for one another as the world outside continued to spiral. The emotional reprieve they found in each other also revealed an unexpected truth. They were stronger now than they had ever been. Time, loss, and betrayal had reshaped them into people more grounded, more self-aware, and less consumed by the need to prove themselves. Victoria was no longer the ruthless corporate heir trying to measure up to her father's impossible standards. She was now a woman who had faced loss, failure, and rediscovery and had emerged with clarity. Nate, once desperate for power and recognition, had begun to see that fulfillment didn't come from boardrooms or manipulation, but from honesty and integrity. Their shared pain had become a crucible, and through it, they had both shed old versions of themselves. Neither of them was in a hurry to return to the corporate world that had once devoured their values and nearly destroyed their relationship. If anything, they now saw the office and its endless power plays as a trap. A place where ambition disguised itself as purpose and loyalty was merely a commodity to be traded. Instead, they began to imagine a different kind of future, one not tethered to Newman Enterprises or hostile boardroom takeovers. A future built not on conquest, but connection. In quiet conversations, they dreamed of what that life might look like. They talked about community work, about mentoring others who had once felt as lost as they had, about building something meaningful rather than just profitable. And for the first time in a long time, those dreams didn't feel naive. They felt necessary. But even as their bond deepened, old shadows began to creep in. Nate began to hear murmurs that Audra was slipping back into old habits. Her name surfaced in business circles again, often tied to schemes that bore her unmistakable touch. Rumors suggested she was quietly forming alliances, manipulating assets under shell companies, even courting key figures who had once refused to work with her. At first, Nate dismissed the gossip. But when an old colleague hinted that Audra had approached someone close to the Newman family under a new alias, something inside him shifted. He began to suspect that whatever transformation she had claimed was temporary at best, a mask that had finally begun to crack. Conflicted and angry, Nate found himself needing to talk to someone who would understand, not just what Audra had done, but what it meant to see someone you once trusted slipping into darkness. So he told Victoria everything. Not just about the rumors, but about the confusion and guilt still lingering from his past with Audra, how he had ignored the warning signs, how ambition had blinded him to who she truly was, and how even now, he feared she would hurt someone else. Victoria listened with the patience of someone who had once been there herself, deceived, manipulated, made to doubt her own instincts. And when he was finished, she didn't offer judgment. She offered truth. She told him that knowing the truth didn't always mean knowing what to do with it, that sometimes, strength came not from action, but from choosing not to fall back into old patterns. And slowly, Nate began to realize that this space, this connection, this quiet resilience between them was what he had needed all along. Not revenge. Not redemption. But someone who understood him not despite his flaws, but because of them. So as the weeks stretched on, while the rest of Genoa City braced for the next wave of corporate warfare and scandal, Nate and Victoria chose something different. They chose stillness. They chose authenticity. And perhaps most importantly, they chose each other. What came next didn't matter. Whether Kane's secrets would unravel in court, whether Victor's empire would rise or fall, whether Audra would destroy herself or someone else, none of it could alter what Nate and Victoria had reclaimed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even entirely safe. But it was real. And in a city built on illusion, that made all the difference. If you'd like to continue this story with a dramatic twist involving Victor discovering Nate and Victoria's renewed closeness, or Audra sabotaging them once again, or even Claire becoming unexpectedly protective of their bond, I can absolutely build that out. Let me know your next direction.